Welcome to PR Talk, sponsored by the PRSA of Oregon. This is your host, Amy Rosenberg, founder of Veracity and author of A Modern Guide to Public Relations. Help other people find our podcast by subscribing, rating, giving us a review, or sharing on social media. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, everyone. I have Douglas Simon here on the line. He's the CEO of DS Simon Media. Hi, Doug.
Hey, Amy. Thanks so much for speaking with me.
Yeah, so I want to get into your company and what you do, but just to give everybody some background, you have owned and operated your company for 35 years. And so that's quite an accomplishment. So just tell us about your company. It's a little different than the traditional PR firm, I would say.
Sure. I started very young, and we've really had a consistent sort of guidepost to us, which is about helping clients get their story out on television news. Originally, that was done with what were called video news releases, video press releases, content that we produced that would send out to stations, which is still used on some occasions. But starting in the early 1990s, we started doing what are called satellite media tours. And the idea was that instead of having to travel from market to market to get your spokesperson interviewed on television about a story of importance to the local audience, you could actually do it from a distance, either from a studio or from location. As you can imagine, it's evolved quite a bit over the last 35 years we've been doing it.
Yeah, so I do want to hear about satellite media tours and how you put them together and how they work. But first, what happened to the video news release? Is that just a thing of the past? And why is that?
Sure. Well, video news releases still exist, though there's a much smaller number of projects for which it makes sense. Basically, in about 2005, they became very controversial. A liberal group, somewhat ironically, was concerned about the Bush administration's, and this is George W. Bush, not being accurate with information it put out there. And at the time, CNN had distribution systems that PR people could buy time on to have it distributed to all their affiliates. So that became quite controversial. There were even Senate hearings at which I testified. So because of that, stations became more reticent about using outside produced video, which previously they would use without identifying that it was outside produced video. So where it used to be available as a tool for almost any story you were doing, it became limited to something that would be a major kind of event that would attract a lot of public interest that broadcasters didn't necessarily have access to.
Mm-hmm. So then do people just not simply send BRoll to the press anymore? Or is that a little different than a full-on?
Yeah, the distinction between a video news release and BRoll is the BRoll is footage that would require a station to edit it to put it on their broadcast. A video news release is actually a produced piece that would almost be ready for air. We still do a number of B-roll type projects. Some are footage of events, major news announcements, others in the healthcare space for medical journals, where we would include a scripted piece more as a guide for the station, so to make sure that they get the nuances correctly, that they get the story right instead of leaving it to chance.
Okay, so you submit the B-roll with somewhat of a script.
Yeah, there would be a scripted piece produced. That's happening for most of the stories we do, except for something that would be just an event. For instance, working with Macy's before the Thanksgiving Day parade, show behind the scenes of them getting ready for the parade. That's footage lots of stations want. Difficult to provide access to all of them, especially last year during COVID. So that would be the type of story where footage would work to get your story out to the media.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us about how satellite media tours actually work and how you organize those and whatnot.
Sure. Well, the three components, I should say, the three key components are that you have a story that's of interest, you have a spokesperson available, and you have a date and a time that you're making it available to the media. So once you have those things, you can then pitch the media, craft a pitch that is approved by the client, and pitch the media to get your story out on television and radio. Radio is frequently combined with the satellite media tour. So we have a booking team in-house that will reach out to the stations to try and schedule interviews. Usually stations get 5 to 10 minute windows where they can conduct the interview. And that includes connecting to us via the technology that we're providing to them, doing the interview, and saying goodbye about that. And obviously, that's not only changed over the 35 years, but since the onset of COVID, there's been a dramatic change in how stations have produced and connected to spokespeople, which we have some very recent survey data, which would be of interest to your viewers.
If you don't mind, what are the changes that you've discovered?
Well, the biggest change was that no one was going into a TV station to be interviewed for a story. That dropped to zero of that. That just wasn't happening. Secondly, even having people connect to a station from a studio, it wasn't necessarily safe for someone to go into a studio where there was a crew. So what it evolved to, and Zoom was a major help to this, is where through Zoom or a similar type of service, the spokesperson would connect to our control room, and then we would connect them to the TV station for all of the interviews. So it was a dramatic change in a number of positive ways. It increased the authenticity of the interviews. And because of the nature of the pandemic, stories tended to be of greater interest to local news media. And there was greater access to get, higher level people who really knew the story to communicate, because they didn't necessarily have to go anywhere and add all that extra time to getting themselves on television.
So in a way, it already fits into what you're already doing with doing media tours by satellite.
It did fit very well into that. And, we're very fortunate, as a business owner, and I'm sure everyone can relate, when COVID first hit, in addition to worries about the personal health of yourself and your family, as well as your team, there were clear questions about, how the business would continue to function and survive. So literally on the Monday after the NBA announced it was shutting down its season in March of 2020, which I sort of look at as the starting point when everyone's like, whoa, this is a real thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. The next Monday, we had engineers in retrofitting our control room to be able to handle this type of remote production. And since then, we've actually built a second control center at our New York headquarters, because it's become so popular for brands and nonprofits to engage with broadcasters in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then I have some kind of just detail type questions, because, PR people, or we're detail people. So, now, okay, so you can do this. You can put someone on a tour in the space of about 5 hours. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's typically the length of time that we use. It gives the opportunity to have the 25 to 30 different interviews, as well as other recorded content that we can produce that can be used for social media or other types of placement that are available, without necessarily overwhelming the talent.
But so it sounds like you're really in control over what is happening with the media, in terms of saying, okay, these are our available times, and you get what you get, kind of.
I always want to use the word control loosely when you're talking about mm-hmm. media, because obviously they're free to ask whatever questions they want to. But the reality is that because we're pitching the story and they know our people, they say yes or they say no. We provide them with a confirmation document with suggested questions and a suggested lead-in. And, one of the keys to our success is an overwhelming percentage, between 85 and 90+% of TV stations will ask the exact questions we've provided to them. And when you take a step back, you can imagine a morning news anchor, they're in the middle of the show, they break for weather and traffic, and that's when they might be looking at their paperwork for the upcoming interview for the first time mm-hmm. on that. So having it prepared for them with a flow that's natural and makes sense, there's a good motivation to just stick to what we have provided to them. Of course, they're free to do whatever they want. Also, we can provide them with BRoll footage. We recently did a campaign for the grand opening of the new Legoland New York resort in Goshen, New York, an hour north of the city. So we had B-roll inside exhibits. We had a jib that was giving a panoramic view of the park, and we were in other locations that worked really well to show how dynamic it was. I guess you can say I've drank the Kool-Aid on this one, but it's really a great place to visit, especially if you've got kids between 2 and 12. That's its sort of primary target. But you're able to show them, show B-roll, and frequently the anchors were like just wow, because it really is mind-boggling what you see. So it's really effective not only to provide an interview opportunity, but include footage and B-roll, as you mentioned, with us actually controlling what B-roll we're using with station permission. Digging into the weeds just a little bit, because I know you love the details and I'm sort of a detail geek as well. We'll actually have a producer on with the station and we'll say, we have B-roll of this. Is it okay for us to roll it in now? So it's not like we're just randomly doing it. It's all in communication with the stations we work with. Some of them have their own footage. Some of them may be recording the piece to edit it later and will ask us to put the B-roll after. So it's a very flexible medium, which is a key part of why it's been so successful.
Yeah, and you're right there handling it in the moment with the TV stations, because we all know that TV is pretty much, well, and radio is pretty much hurry up. And maybe wait, but maybe not. So let me ask
Amy,
you.
Before you jump to the next question, one thing that I think is important for context at this moment is earlier about the changes with COVID. One of the things, and obviously as a professional public relations person, communicator, you want to be there with your spokesperson when they're conducting an interview. When it was being done from a studio, that was very easy. You're sitting in the green room. So what's really gone virtual about them is the green room aspect, where the PR person can watch the interview, hear the station questions, and even interact with their spokesperson between interviews. So that's an important piece. It's not like spokesperson, good luck, we'll see you in 5 hours. The PR people can be engaging with the whole production team and their spokespeople as the tour is happening.
Well, and then what technology do you use to make that happen so that somebody can be listening in?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of different technologies. Our one broadcast center, which is connected to studios, multiple HD cameras if you're on location, but we'll take in signal from the spokesperson primarily via Zoom. The other one uses a proprietary technology called vMix installed into the system, but those systems allow us to roll in video, record the interviews, patch the station into the spokesperson so they can hear the questions being asked by the anchors. And in cases where there are two spokespeople at the same time, they can even hear each other when they're answering the question. So it makes for a very fluid response. But it's a lot of infrastructure. And I should also add a lot of really talented production people, a technical director, a phone producer who's connecting with the stations. Audio is critical for the quality of the program. So, an audio engineer with expertise in that specific control room is vital.
So then one last question about satellite media tours is I saw online that you can literally guarantee, well, maybe I shouldn't use the word literally, but you can guarantee 25 to 30 media interviews within a tour. So I'm just wondering, that's like for a PR person to kind of say that. I mean, so how can you guarantee that?
Sure. And the way that works, within a 5-hour time period, there are usually about 35 or so potential slots. So our package includes a mix of earned media, and we also have brand integration with some syndicated shows that are available. Clearly, our motivation is to make it the best possible story so we can book the most stations. But as the media has evolved, more stations offer brand integration where they're paid a fee to have an interview run on their station. So we factor that into our production. If our media team doesn't do as good a job to make sure we do our guarantee, we'll have a mix of earned media and brand integration. Obviously, our motivation and the clients is to make the story as compelling enough that we can book enough stations ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense. And so what are co-op media tours?
Sure. Co-op media tour, and I'll take a step back because most tours that we do are for an individual client, a nonprofit or brand trying to tell their story. And in that way, they have as much control as is possible with the media intervention about the story flow, what the questions will be, what will be discussed. But they're also responsible for funding the entire project. Sometimes clients don't necessarily have the budget or a compelling enough story, but it might be relevant in a specific time period, like back to school would be one, or holidays. So in that case, what we do is we hire a spokesperson who's well known in that area, and then try and get 3 to 4 to 5 different clients whose product or service would be a natural fit in a story, say, on back to school. You might have someone who's selling clothing for kids. Doing eye checkups could be part of it, but it all has to relate to the central theme. There's also a popular tool that's used at trade shows. Co-op media tours used to be an even larger part of the industry. Now they're mostly used for these specific kind of stories where you want to be part of a narrative, and you can save it only is about 40% of the cost of doing your own media tour.
And how are they used in trade shows, really quick?
Well, sure. Say would be a trade show like the Consumer Technology Association CES show. Mm-hmm. What are the new products being introduced at? Fill in the blank of the trade show. So again, you've got multiple different clients who can legitimately participate in that kind of story.
Okay.
So there's a spokesperson that's hired, though what we're seeing, and even 85% of stations prefer when the client uses a spokesperson who is in-house, worked with the company, than a third party outside spokesperson. The station producers find it much more authentic, and we all know how important authenticity is to brands and nonprofits in sharing their messages.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. So now I assume do you work with a lot of PR firms or PR people who bring a client in to you to help?
It's a split. Sometimes we work with clients directly. Sometimes we work with agencies. Sometimes we work with individual practitioners. Of course, those never cross. If we work with an agency, we would never work with the client directly. And sometimes they have different roles in that. A lot of it depends on what the agency's contract is like with the brand. Would media placement be part of what the agency is providing, or is a separate piece to it? There's also a question of, does the agency want to devote the time of its people to the package, and is the client comfortable being billed for that? So those are some of the factors. But what we've seen, especially during COVID and even continuing as the pandemic hopefully eases, is a dramatic increase in demand for this product or service from the end client side. And as you probably know, Amy, and you may be an exception as an author and someone who really understands pitching the media and is focused on being successful on that, most PR firms and most PR people feel that it's harder to get their client on television, especially the nationals, the cable networks. That became almost impossible as they focused overwhelmingly on politics. But local TV news stations don't have that same focus. They're counter-programming. In fact, in the week leading up to the presidential election, they spent just about a third of their time on politics. So there's a lot of space if you come up with an idea for a story that's locally relevant and you can deliver it and it's of interest. So we've seen a dramatic growth in organizations wanting to get their exposure to local news, also recognizing that local news viewership has grown tremendously during the pandemic. According to Nielsen, 64% of people who work from home, as you know, that's a growing number, watch local TV news at least once a week. So, and the group, they're getting younger, they're becoming more diverse. In fact, African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, those are the fastest growing segments of the local TV news viewing audience. According to Nielsen, they've grown, I believe it was, 18 to 34 demographic grew 135%
Wow.
in the last year.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's cool. Well, yay for local news, because, for a while it was a little hit and miss. So now how can PR people, if they want to do this on their own, if they have the time or the budget from the client, how can they do video for press and send it to them?
Sure. Well, there are two alternatives, and we can look at the B-roll and then the media tour piece. I would think that any PR agency and any end client brand or nonprofit should have a quality setup where if they get an opportunity to get their CEO, their lead executive, someone with an expertise on a subject, they can do one-on-one interviews without needing anyone on the outside to make it happen. That's a must. It's almost a point of negligence if you're not set up to be able to do that. The trick comes in the media tour world if you've got a full campaign. While you might be able to set up one interview and make that happen pretty efficiently, one, you won't be able to have your PR people listening and involved in that. And two, is from our surveys, we found that stations want to receive the content in very different ways. More than 80% were taking in interviews by Zoom. Over 40% wanted satellite interviews, and close to 40% even wanted you to create a file and physically send it to them. So being able to set up to transmit to stations in all those different ways and handle, say, 25 to 30 interviews while the PR person can listen in and interact, that's a whole different level of physical capability that's available.
Mm-hmm.
So almost certainly you'd need to work with an outside company if that's what you're looking to do. When it comes to the B-roll and footage size, one of the key things that you want to do after you create the content is to be able to have it online in a way that stations can effectively download it, or you want to have a file that you can send to them. In an ideal way, what you would want to do is create a landing page where there's viewing content of the video. You can use YouTube or some other format. So a reporter you email could easily check out the video content you're sharing. And then if they're interested, they could download it. You don't want to make them download it without having viewed it because they're not going to waste their time to do that. In most cases, also, you want to let them view it in specific pieces. So then when they download it, it can be in smaller chunks and won't take, hours to make it be made available to them. So those are two ways that you can get footage to the media.
So then if you can't do a landing page for your client because of whatever reason, can you email a link, let's say to YouTube or even Google Drive, and say, here's the video? Or would they not look at it, is what you're saying?
They might look at it, but if you're doing it that way, it's got to be even more compelling to get them interested in taking it. What's better is like an MP4 format, and we have other people on our team who can go over the technology if you want to follow up, or people could reach out to me through email or give me a call, and I'd be happy to put them in touch with the technology. But usually it's a file that can be downloaded because that way the quality will be better.
Okay, great. So any just like last minute tips for video, whether it's worst mistakes you've seen in video for press or, good tips to remember if we're doing B-roll for press?
Sure. Remember, you're telling a story. So there's a couple of pieces to it. One is, are you delivering something that you can pitch effectively? And two, when it's on the air, will it provide value to you? One of the things that's often missed in the satellite media tour space is it's a conversation. It's 3 minutes plus for most of the interactions. So that means you can cover more than one topic. That means you don't have to jump into your commercial message right off the top, but you can use a formula such as problem solution, something people can relate to, and then your product or service is one example of how it can be dealt with. You also want to have a mindset of informing and educating people and providing value. Again, I would recommend using your own internal spokesperson for authenticity. It's better for bookings. It's what stations want, and it brings value to your brand because you're getting that name recognition throughout.
Okay, great. So you mentioned if people have questions for your company, how can they find you and reach out?
Sure. Our website is ds as in Sam, dssimon.com. My personal email is Doug S for my last name at, again, dssimonmedia.com. So those are two ways. I don't know if people are texting or using cell phone these days. My number is 917-952-7007, which I actually feel pretty cool that I have that number.
That is pretty cool. And actually very generous that you would give your number out these days. So thank you very much for joining us. And this is very fascinating and just you are a new PR tool that PR people can use, your company. It sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank
Amy,
you.
knowing who your audience is, I feel comfortable giving out the number.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. I'll talk to a PR person any day, really. I mean, we all speak the same language, so it's fine.
Thanks for listening to the PR Talk podcast. Find Amy's book, A Modern Guide to Public Relations, plus more PR Talk episodes at prtalk.co. And remember to subscribe, rate, and review.